So Blythe is a really skillful orchardist and has been the person who really put the hard legwork into this, developing this presentation this evening. Ed Buyarski's been doing horticulture and edible landscape work through his business, Ed's Edible Landscapes in Juneau, and working in this field since the early 1980s. I want to point out that all the programs are recorded. All these are recorded on the website. The first one is Workshop 1, which is about starting an orchard. Workshop 2 is planting fruit trees. Workshop 3 is growing fruit trees in a greenhouse, which is a very unique opportunity to look at what two growers in Alaska are doing. Both using very different approaches. I'll say that Darren Snyder, who's the UAF Cooperative Extension Service agent for the Southeast Alaska, is our host tonight, hosting the Zoom website. The March 6th program is going to be a really great one, and we will have a 90-minute presentation by author Michael Phillips, who is the author of Apple Grower, The Holistic Orchard, and Mycorrhizal Planet, and is just simply one of the world's preeminent holistic orchard experts and educators. And he'll be doing another program. That March 6th program is at 10 a.m. to accommodate his difference in time on the East Coast. In late March, we'll be doing a field trip with pruning in the focus, and also gathering and picking scion wood for harvesting scion wood for later grafting. And then on April 3rd, Michael Phillips will be back on Saturday, April 3rd at 10 a.m. with fungal duff management, which is a really important idea that basically we take care of the fungus and the fungus takes care of the trees. So I will turn it over to Blythe Carter. And thanks so much, everybody who's here. And I hope you're enjoying these programs. I'll say one last thing before I jump off here, is that this is a program that is being run by the Chilkat Valley Historical Society. And you can become a member of the Chilkat Valley Historical Society if you're interested. And the link to their website is on the Orchard Project website. Okay, there you go. Thanks so much.
Thank you, and everybody, welcome. I want to just start off with saying that there are many different ways and reasons for pruning. And what I'm sharing tonight is just what's worked for me, what I've learned over the years. And so I hope you guys can make good use of it. We'll go ahead and launch right into the power of pruning here. All right, so pruning and training. What we're going to go over here is why to prune and train, some of the basics, the tools of the trade, the basic techniques of pruning, the different tree forms, when and what to prune, how to do some training, and how to renovate a neglected tree, and then also how to apply this all to other plants.
One quick thing, you might, if you go back to that slide, the previous one, it's a beautiful picture of Dolgo crab apples. So just telling people what they're seeing is worthwhile, so they can lust for some of these for their yard.
That's a pretty image there, beautiful apples. So why to prune and train? So basically an unpruned tree, it's a feral tree. It's often unhealthy and overworked, especially as we've bred fruit trees to fruit very young and prolifically. However, the tree's basic goal is to produce seeds, and ours is to produce fruit. These seems like they're the same thing, but they're actually not. For instance, an apple tree in the wild will produce as much small fruit as it can, because that means it's producing lots and lots of seeds. We, however, want the actual fruit to eat, so a bunch of seedy fruit isn't what we want. So pruning and training enables us to maintain and control the tree size, maximize healthy fruit production, and maintain accessibility for harvesting and netting, keep the tree healthy, remove winter and wildlife damage, and also just for aesthetic appeal of the tree. So this is why we prune. First off, in order to prune effectively, you really need to know some of the basics of tree anatomy, the different types of buds that you'll see on the tree, and how the tree actually grows. So anatomy of a fruit tree. We all know the basics, the roots, the trunk, the canopy, all the leaves, all that stuff. But there's some certain terms that you'll come into contact with when you're pruning and dealing with trees. And some of this is like a crotch. It's the angle where the branches fork or where a main limb joins the trunk. Strong crotches are wide angled. They're 45 degrees or more. And when a crotch is narrow, the limb is more likely to break. So for instance, right here, we've got a narrow one versus this nice wide angle here. A scaffolding are the limbs that make up the branching from the trunk, the ones that make up from the trunk. So basically think of it as the load-bearing walls of your house. It's what supports the tree. Water sprout, it's a very aggressive, very vigorous shoot that forms from a dominant bud on an old branch. A dormant bud on an old branch. And you need to remove these. So this right here is a water sprout. They go up really fast. Suckers are a shoot that starts from the roots. And since most of our trees are on rootstock, this means it is not a type of tree you actually want. It's not going to give you the fruit that you want. So you need to remove those too.
And one more on that one, just removing suckers removes, the tree is going to put energy into all of its growth. So if you remove the suckers, then the new growth is going to go up into the main trunk of the tree and out into the branches. Same thing with all those water sprouts, vigorous growth. They take energy, so you want to push that energy out into the branches, and so that it produces leaves and flowers and fruit.
Yes, exactly. And a lot of the times, like a sucker that's coming from the rootstock will actually be really, really super vigorous and can actually take over the tree and direct all that energy into it instead of the type of tree you want. So you really need to remove those suckers. So telling the difference between a growth bud, a flower bud, and a spur, it's really important. The flower bud, it's a fat, fuzzy, plump bud it's going to produce flowers and eventually fruit, assuming that it's pollinated. A spur is a small side branch which produces these flower buds. They look like small, stubby, compressed stems with the fruiting buds on them. On an apple and pears and plums and sweet cherries, they can actually last, these spurs can last for a very long time, up to 10 years. But on sour cherries, they're very short-lived, normally surviving 1, maybe 2 years. So this right here shows you a branch. It's actually a branch of a plum tree and all these little spurs, these short little stubby branches coming off of it. All those will have flower buds on them. I just took this picture a couple days ago, so they're completely dormant right now. But once they start coming out, you'll see that they're plump and fuzzy. Right here, we've got an example of an apple spur. This is the European plum, closer up. This one here is a Japanese plum. You can see there's a little bit of a difference between each one of them. In this sweet cherry one, there's actually 2 spurs here and then a bunch of other little flower buds also. So you need to know this and compare to the difference of that with a growth bud. So a growth bud will produce leaves, but no woody growth unless stimulated by pruning or say a branch breaks off or something like that. They are smaller than flower buds, more pointed and grow flush with the branch. You can see this one right here. Zoom in on this. You can see how small it is and it's just sort of flush right there in that branch. And then the terminal bud right up here, it's a growth bud that's at the tip of a branch. Removing a terminal bud will stimulate the buds below to produce woody side shoots, which will become new lateral branches. So this right here, terminal bud, if you remove that, these other buds will get activated. So this brings us to how fruit trees grow. So young trees, they're programmed to grow upwards as quickly as possible to outcompete their neighbors and for access to that precious sunlight. This can be seen in this picture right here. It's out in front of the Bald Eagle Foundation. And those limbs are just, they're crowded and they're shooting straight up. And you're asking yourself, well, doesn't Mother Nature take care of itself? The problem is that modern fruit trees have been domesticated and bred by us to produce fruit super early and prolifically. And they're very often grown in locations where they could never naturally propagate themselves. So a truly wild apple, if you were to go find one that's completely wild out in the woods or somewhere, it produces a sour, seedy fruit about the size of a marble. And they're actually, they look a lot like a wild rose hip, which the apple tree is actually closely related to a rose hip, or a rose rather. So that's why you just can't let them do their own thing. So we go back to the whole reaching for the sun thing. This behavior is fueled partially by something called apical dominance or apical dominance. It means that the most upright central branch, or the leader of a tree, is dominant over, which means it grows more quickly, than other branches. Hormones at the terminal bud, or the tip of the tree, of branches actually inhibit the growth of other tissues, such as the lower buds on the limb. Therefore, by pruning off the tip of a branch, making a heading cut, we activate the dominant buds below, causing them to grow. So when multiple leaders are allowed or forced to form on a tree, the tree's energy must be divided between them. So instead of 4 feet of growth on one limb, the central leader, you would get 1 foot of growth on 4 limbs. Of course, this isn't going to be exactly that, but you get the idea here. It divides that energy, just like we were saying before, right? The sucker dividing the energy too. It divides that energy between those different limbs. Vertical limbs grow faster than lateral, more horizontal limbs. And the more horizontal a branch, the more fruiting wood, buds and spurs, it will actually produce. So those are really important things to know about trees and how they grow. The next thing is the fruiting habit of the tree. So different trees produce fruit on different years' growth. So for instance, an apple versus a plum. Some produce on 1-year-old wood, so last year's growth. Others on 2-year-old or 3-year-old or older wood, and all places in between. This is called the tree's fruiting habit. Before you begin to prune, you need to know what fruiting habit your tree has. For instance, if you prune a sour cherry the same way you prune an apple, you may never see any fruit on that sour cherry. So the fruiting habit, I've got a little list here to help people out of different types of trees. The apple, we see it's on 3-plus-year-old wood. Pears, it's on 2-plus-year-old wood. Plums, it's on the base of 1-year-old shoots and the length of 2-plus-year-old woods. Sweet cherries, the same thing. Sour cherries is almost completely on 1-year-old wood. And same with peaches. Apricots, if you're lucky enough to get an apricot to work for you up here, it's on the base of 1-year-old shoots and the length of 2-year-old wood also. So very important to know what tree you're dealing with and how it fruits before you go chopping off a bunch of limbs. Then we get into the tools of the trade. So these are some of my basic pruning tools that I have. You've got the pruners, that's these smaller ones. They're good for woody stems up to 1/2 inch in diameter. The lopper, this is this one here. It's good for thicker branches. There's the handsaw right here. And you want one specifically made for pruning, not for anything else. They're good for branches that are larger, that are too large for loppers to handle. And then the grafting knife right here is really handy for tidying up larger cuts. Important to remember that all tools should be sharp and clean. Unfortunately, a dull blade makes a ragged cut, and a dirty blade may introduce harmful pathogens.
I'll throw a few more tools in here that don't have a picture of them. Having a pole pruner, I know you and I and others would rather not get up on ladders if we can help it. If we can keep our trees shorter, then we can stay on the ground. And with a pole pruner, some of which are telescoping, Some are, and there's a whole bunch of different kinds. There's pole pruners with saws on them. There's some that have loppers on them. There are some that have little mini chainsaws on them, which are really pretty cool. And then, of course, there are real chainsaws, which are pretty, to me, unsafe and unpleasant to work with on a ladder or if I'm climbing up in a big old tree, as well as a sawzall and or reciprocating saw. And those are great too, because they've got all sorts of different kinds of blades available, which includes wood, specific to wood cutting blades, which are great for pruning. Again, you might use those, and they've got a narrow blade, so sometimes there's really tight spots. It's difficult to get a pruning saw or loppers in to places. And there's cordless as well as corded saws. I must say, I've got several of each. I've got buckets of tools. But if it's a wet, rainy day out there, using a corded electric tool can be excessively stimulating, especially if you're up on a ladder or up on a tree. So the cordless ones are going to be safer to use in wet weather. And in Haines, maybe you have more choice. You have more choices of when to prune and when not. Here in Juneau and Point South, sometimes we have to prune when it's raining. So we have to be careful. Again, use some gloves, because these tools can certainly take off a finger or other parts as efficiently if they're sharp. And otherwise, even having if you're using a lot of knife work, sometimes even, especially when we're grafting, using some duct tape on the opposing hand's fingers. If you're right-handed, duct tape or glove the left hand, because I have some that have been prematurely shortened, shall we say. So here, and the other thing true in pruning, as far as tools, having another person, if you're pruning a sizable tree, having another person there to look or watch as you are doing the pruning, because sometimes, especially on a big tree, it's good, it's hard to see the branches for the tree, and your helper, they can certainly steady you on a ladder, but they can also help you make the right choice of branches so you don't cut the wrong ones. Or they can say, nope, not that one, that's the next one up and 3 feet over. So again, use safety glasses. Again, if you're making saw cuts, particularly with whatever tool, some safety glasses.
Yeah, when you're using power tools, you're definitely going to want to take extra precautions so you don't, prune something you really would rather have on your body.
Right. And a hard hat wouldn't hurt either.
No, yes. Yeah, a lot of the power tools that you're talking about, you'd be using on like an old neglected tree or something like that. With smaller ones, these tools would probably work on it quite well. I would steer away from the power tools if it's just a small tree, unless it's something that's really needs to come out, a big limb or something.
Yeah, having the right size tool for the job really helps. So you say going from the small hand pruners to the loppers that can take larger branches. And apple wood, a lot of the fruit wood is really harder material compared to, say, a willow or an alder is much softer wood, much easier to prune.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, yes. And young limbs, the same way, much easier to prune than the older ones. Yeah.
And live limbs, of course, are softer than the deadwood too. Yes. Deadwood can be harder to prune.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of keeping your tools clean, we're talking a little bit about tool hygiene. You want to sanitize your blade between cuts, and especially between trees, or you risk spreading a disease such as bacterial canker through your entire orchard. These pictures are of bacterial canker. You really don't want that in your orchard. It can kill the poor tree or disfigure limbs and mess with your fruit. It can really do a lot of damage. Even if you only have one tree, a contaminated tool can spread it throughout your tree and overwhelm its natural defenses. So sanitizing can be accomplished by carrying a squirt bottle of bleach, just 1 teaspoon and 2 cups of water with you as you prune, and spray the blades of your tools between cuts, or at least, at the very least, go ahead and do that between trees. Another reminder, never use someone else's pruning tools without thoroughly sanitizing them.
And I'll throw in one more in here with disease. If you get new young trees, whether they're potted or bare root, you should inspect them also carefully. I have gotten potted trees from down south that have come with harlequin bugs, which actually that's indicated by tiny little holes with sawdust coming out of them. That's not a good one. I've gotten trees with several different cankers. I've contacted the nursery that I got them from to refund or replace them. But again, look carefully at your tree to see that they are healthy, and you aren't bringing in bugs and diseases with them, which again might contaminate some of your existing trees if you have some.
Yeah, I mean, Alaska itself doesn't have a lot of natural pathogens here that affect the fruit trees we want to grow, but you're going to get most of them brought in by ordering from a nursery. So yeah, definitely inspect those trees.
Then that may also even when you order your trees, to look for disease resistance like scab. I mean, once you have scab, you have scab. I mean, the trees are going to have it,
right?
And there's sprays for it, as well as a few other diseases that we might get around here. So again, watching your trees carefully as they grow, if you have diseases, and maybe somewhere in here you may be talking about cutting below, pruning off branches which may be diseased, and how far back you have to cut.
I actually haven't gone into that. I think it might be a good idea to have a class specifically on diseases and how to deal with them. Anyway, we'll go ahead and continue on here into the basic techniques of cutting. So every cut, large or small, should be cleanly made so that the plant tissue is not torn or bruised. Slanting cuts are usually preferred, so rain will not collect on the surface. So you can see over here, when you cut down to an alternate bud, which is what you would be doing when you were doing a heading cut rather, you want to make a slanting cut about 1/4 of an inch above the bud, at about a 45-degree slope, which will allow moisture to roll off the cut and it discourages diseases. This shows you a good cut here, the correct kind you want to do, an incorrect one. This one is too slanted, so it's making an unnecessarily large wound. This one is too close to the bud. It probably would kill the bud here, so you don't want to do that, obviously. And this one is too high, which it'll cause this to die back about to where the bud is. And so you've just got some dead wood there that, will eventually rot. Cutting to a replacement shoot is here. We've got this nice limb here. You want to choose a strong, healthy shoot growing in a direction that will enhance the shape of the tree and cut in line with this direction of growth. So basically they're saying they want you to cut right there so that it's at the same angle as this growth coming off of it. Cutting back to a main stem. When you cut back you want to cut back to the raised collar at the base of the branch. That's this right here. You want to cut right in front of that so that the wound does not interfere with the sap flow at the main branch or the trunk. If the branch is large and heavy, make cut number 1, it's right here, through the bark. Then cut number 2, so you're cutting off the main branch, to remove the limb before you make this cut, because this will prevent the limb from ripping off the tree before your cut is complete. This is particularly important when you're doing a very heavy branch, like when you're renovating an old tree, one that's been neglected, or you're just renovating your tree, you want some new growth on that. Very important. I made the mistake when I was trying to fix up a tree of not doing this little cut here and removing that, and it was a pretty sad little tree that I had afterwards. So just remember that when you're doing that. Next off is pinching and rubbing. Sometimes the best tools are actually your own fingers. Young shoots can be rubbed or pinched out at the base, the same way you would a sucker on a tomato plant. Older branches can be pinched off at the tip before they become woody and harden to stimulate branching lower down. This will also could just, if you simply don't want that branch to grow out anymore in that direction, that'll also just kind of stall it if you just pinch off the tip. Right here, you could just take your fingers and just pinch that off and tell it to go away. And that'll normally stop the growth there. So sometimes your fingers are the best thing.
I'll agree with that one, and particularly on buds, you know, even before they start to grow, and it's easier on younger trees to do this than big old ones. Mm-hmm. But again, in the early spring, while they're starting to come out of dormancy, buds are expanding. Sometimes you see buds where, well, you think about it, you don't want those buds there to grow out. You know, perhaps they would fill in a space where you want more air circulation, or the bud is pointing in the wrong direction. So just a thumbnail, you can just pop the bud off really easily at that time. And it really applies. Another place I do this a lot. Sometimes you'll see where water sprouts want to grow from nearly horizontal branches. You'll see those buds just starting to pop up. Just pop them off before they start to grow. And on another kind of plant, this really works well. It happens very often, are lilacs, which this commonly happens. And again, you see those big buds growing in places where you don't want them. So that's just another place, and really easy to do. You don't need any tools but your fingers.
Right. Yeah. So you can just reach down there, do it real quick, and then move on. It's a really handy thing, and it saves energy from for the tree putting into something that's just going to get cut off later. And like I said, easy to do.
And something like on the cherry trees too, where it's really easy to see those clusters of flower buds. And you think, especially if it's a young tree, maybe you don't even, normally we can allow them to flower, but don't let them have fruit. But you can also just rub some of those buds off them so that they aren't using any of that energy in their formative years to try to grow fruit too soon.
Right. Exactly. Yes. So you might be wondering, okay, but how do you get a branch to grow in the direction you want, right? So an outside bud will usually produce an outside branch. The placement of the bud on the stem points the direction of the new branch. So by selecting a bud that points in the direction you want your future branch to go, you can just prune off just above it, and that's the way your branch will go. Basically, you look at this little illustration here. If you prune this off there, this one will be activated and it'll sprout out that way. If you prune this one off, it'll be activated and it'll sprout this way. So you just choose the direction you want it to go, basically. Look at the branch and figure it out. Go ahead and move on. So we have tree forms, the biggie here. So tree forms come in many styles, but we'll concentrate on those basic forms most suited for the outdoors in Southeast Alaska. That's the central leader, modified central leader, and an open center or vase shape. First off, the central leader, that's this first one right here. The main leader is promoted and other branches are allowed or forced to grow at an angle from it, somewhat resembling a Christmas tree. The leader may be terminated at a certain height to prevent it from getting too tall. So, you'd cut it off here, and that way you wouldn't have it getting way over your head. A modified central leader is very similar. The modified central leader differs from the central leader by having a more rounded top. That's this one. Basically what they do is the dominant leader is suppressed after a time, and secondary leaders are allowed to develop. These secondary leaders divide the growing energy or dominance between several growing points, creating a shorter tree with a more rounded shape. It's basically like what we were saying before, dividing that energy. The last form, this open center or V shape, The leader is pruned out at about 3 or 4 feet to give a branched headed, open centered tree. The branches are evenly and well placed, spaced rather, around and along the upper third of the trunk to give structural strength. The trunk height can vary to accommodate heavy snow depth, but the branches, especially I've found of Japanese plums, may need to be supported when they're young under heavy snow, wet snow. So you have to go out there and shake them off if it snows a whole bunch. But I in particular like this open center or vase shape because I do not like ladders. So it's worked really well for me. What is your preference, Ed?
So I too, normally when we get new young trees, they will come pretty much as central leader trees, maybe lightly branched. And so that's the time to choose what you want for the long term. And I have a tendency to go to the modified central leader if at all possible. And again, part of this is if you don't want the tree to get too tall. And as the trees get older, I tend to prune them out more toward an open center. And part of that is here in Southeast Alaska, particularly to open up the tree so air circulation is improved, so the leaves, the flowers, the fruits can dry out more quickly, and to allow more sun into the center of the tree, which contributes toward better fruit color and more sugar content. So again, opening it up more. And so again, you may look at an old tree, it may have any one of these possible shapes. But again, as the tree gets older, I tend to go toward the more open center if possible. As you say,
smaller too, right?
If you've got a big tree, it's also a little, I don't know if it's necessarily easier to climb if you're to the point of having a tree that size. But of course, then along comes a bear and he ruins all of your nice pruning plans if you haven't protected those trees. And suddenly you have a really sad looking broken down tree.
Yes. Let's avoid the pruning that the bears and the moose do, right? All your plants will go up in smoke otherwise, or can. All right, other tree forms that you can see here. This little picture here shows the Espalier patterns that can be made with trees. So orchardists have developed numerous tree forms suited to their needs or desires. And this picture is just a sample, and it doesn't even include commercial forms. So unfortunately, on our short summers and harsh winters, they just don't lend themselves to such intense formal training. It can be done, but it's with great difficulty. Yes, please.
Yeah, I'll jump in here, and I don't know about the great difficulty part, but again, if we're on small lots, and there's a lot of that here within a subdivision, if we're lucky enough to be able to plant a tree next to a fence or next to there aren't a whole lot of brick walls around, but there's some concrete walls. Usually we don't want to plant these next to houses unless you've got some sort of siding that doesn't need to be painted. I guess steel, say perhaps steel siding. If you've got to be painting it, then you've got to get behind it. But spreading out the tree in this shape against a wall, which is south facing, really can hurry along your ripening time, that extra heat. And if it's underneath a roof line also, again, we're controlling moisture a bit, which also means I suppose you have to water them some. So there are definite advantages.
Yes, I was going to suggest that some of these forms, the Espaliers, would work really well in a greenhouse or, like you said, next to a wall. I did try up here to Espalier a tree. I had it for about 3 years, doing great, looking wonderful. Then it snowed really, really heavy and broke like every single limb off. So that was really, really sad.
And normally these would be permanently supported, whether they have multiple posts, like a post between every, 2 trees and a post and 2 trees and a post, with horizontal wires to which the tree is lightly tied for support, for training and support.
Yes,
So
and I
again,
had mine obviously not as supported as well as I needed to, but I did have it tied and I had it supported, and so it was really sad. It also takes a lot more time and dedication to maintain a tree that's done like this.
but it can be a really, it can be a really nice addition,
Yeah.
a scenic and, well, tasty addition
Yeah.
to the landscape too. So again,
Totally, yeah,
feel
very
good.
beautiful. I mean,
Yeah.
I wish that I had a situation where I could do stuff like this more. In fact, I'm actually planning. I've got another greenhouse that I just put up, and I'm planning to try that out in there. Some of the other things that you can do when you're looking at different tree forms is you can actually experiment. I like to practice on alders and other wild trees and shrubs. See what happens when you do different things. I actually pruned a maple vine tree that came up in my front yard for 3 years. I pruned that thing and trained it, and it was really cool. So it was fun to see what happened as I was pruning it and how it responded to the different things I did. Speaking of commercial orchards, here's a couple pictures from Rob Bishop. I'm not sure exactly what these different forms are, but you can see that they're highly trained. There's lots of wires going up and posts, and I'm not actually sure how this would deal with our snow that we get up in here in Haines. You might have better luck down places farther south there. But a lot of work. They are, however, very highly productive, and which is why the commercial orchards do this. So, just a little
again, if
sample.
you think about the Pacific Northwest just recently, where they had the really nasty ice storms in Washington and Oregon, if they are well enough supported, that's good. You can see the horizontal wires to which the trees are trained going up the V posts. So hopefully they were well tied and supported, because otherwise the orchardists may have lost considerable fruiting, spurs, branches, and all this early season already.
Yes, yeah, it would have been really bad down there with all that snow and ice and everything they got. Hopefully they're okay. Our next question is when to prune. So prune only whenever you can, prune only when it's sunny and no rain is expected for several days. Now, this may not be possible, but if it is, go ahead and do it then. Haines, we do have a bit more sun, so we do have the option of waiting, whereas you may not. But the best practice is try not to prune when it's raining. Remember that pruning always stimulates growth. Even winter pruning, when the tree is dormant, results in abundance of growth in the spring. So spring pruning is between March and late May, approximately, depending on how long winter holds on. You want to prune to remove damaged wood for structure and to stimulate rapid growth. You must also prune to collect scion wood while the tree is completely dormant, which is in March or early April, again, depending on our weather. You don't want to see any activity from buds when you're actually pruning for scion wood, so that's really important. Summer pruning is between June and mid-July. Summer pruning controls tree size. It stimulates more moderate growth and the formation of fruiting buds. This is also why it's important not to prune too late in the season. I'll go into that in more detail in a minute here. Fall and winter pruning. So I only prune during this time when it's absolutely necessary. Say if a bear does damage to your tree, or there's snow damage, say it rips off a branch, you want to go out there and prune then. The problem is to see that in winter, the tree is completely dormant and it cannot heal over a wound at that time. So the wound is just left open and exposed to fungus and various diseases. So try to avoid fall and winter pruning.
This might be the place to mention, okay, well, why not paint over the wound with some tar or some other stuff to protect it from disease, fungus, or drying out and other stuff. And the response normally these days, which is different than it was 30, 40, 50 years ago, was to paint over those cut surfaces. And again, whether it be they had particular tree paint, they had various tar and other stuff. And the research has found that pretty much because there's bacterial spores, fungus spores in the air everywhere around us. First, it's like you can't hardly cut fast enough and paint them over. Better to have the air and the oxygen to dry the surface of, we can hope they dry, the surface of those new cuts, and the sun on them does as much good at preventing disease, assuming that we don't have a long cut surface that dies back, which fungus can get into and go down into the trunk. And even there were old trees I remember seeing that had big cracks in them where they literally put concrete into the big cracks and crevices of trees to fill them in. Better off, don't do that anymore.
Yeah, wow.
One thing I recommend, others have recommended, is using baking soda spray. If you want to just do a little quick spray, which can help, which is a fungicide, is a nice, safe, cheap spray to use if you want to use it on cut surfaces or in the long term for a while gradually as the
wound seals over.
Yes, the healing part starts from the outer end edges. So if you've got a big cut, if you cut a 2 or 3 inch branch off, it's going to take several years to heal over. But the tree does seal off the vascular tissue there. So again, using a little bit of the baking soda spray is good on those. And pretty simple recipe: 1 to 2 tablespoons of of baking soda per quart of water, and a drop or 2 of liquid soap. And you got to keep shaking it as you spray. And you can spray it any time of the year on leaves, just not when they're in flower. And you got to keep shaking it because the baking soda tends to settle out. And again, as a preventive for other fungus stuff, I was just looking it up here, use that spray into late June at least in some scab prevention.
Right. Okay, that's a good idea. Yeah. I mean, using the tar or stuff like that, it's not a natural thing. A tree would never see anything like that normally. And also you risk, like you were saying, sealing in the bad stuff into the wound. And
the tree can't heal over the tar or over the paint very well either, compared to healing over it's just plain, clean cut wood.
Exactly. All right. Summer pruning. I said I would talk a little bit more about that. I'm actually a really big fan of summer pruning, but it must be done at the right time. If you prune too late, you will stimulate growth that does not have time to harden off before winter. This might cause your tree to fail to go dormant when it should and have lots of winter dieback, or even possibly die, especially if it's a very young tree. So from my experience with pruning in the summer, this is the dates that I've found for the different varieties of trees. They produce growth at certain rates and harden off at certain rates. So this is what I found seems to work for me. Late June to July 4th, you can do European plums, Japanese plums, and peaches. Late June to July 15th, so mid-July, is apple, pears, and sweet cherries. And sour cherries, you can prune those puppies pretty much any time. I normally do it all the way from late June all the way through August. Sometimes I will cut off a branch that's too tall and pick the cherries off of it then. So rather than crawling up on a big ladder, I have a really big sour cherry tree that I got before I knew anything about pruning. And so a little note on the Japanese plums. They are the one exception that I have, because they have a tendency to produce a lot of spindly growth that can sag under heavy snow and break off a larger branch. Because of this, I do some tip pruning after the leaves have dropped and just before the snow flies. So I'm talking mid-October for Haines. I go out there, look and see if there's a bunch of spindly branches. If there are, I will actually prune those guys off because I have had the snow break off entire large limbs. Even when they're tied up, I was very saddened by that event.
I have to ask, how are your peaches doing?
My peaches are actually undercovered.
Oh, okay.
So they don't have to worry about this.
Okay. So one more thing too on summer pruning that, I mean, we may have done spring pruning, but again, if we are stimulating a little too much growth, or we see the water sprouts, again, pruning them off in the summer is the time to do that. Mm-hmm. And again, to thin out the growth if we did too much spring pruning, resulting in too much summer growth.
Yeah, and those water sprouts and the suckers, you want to get rid of those regardless of what time of year it is. Just get rid of them. What to prune? So we've got the routine maintenance that you need to do. This should be done every year throughout the year, particularly in the spring and the summer, but through the whole year. You want to remove any unwanted wood. So that means dead wood and winter-killed tips, broken branches, disease and cankers, water sprouts, those things we were talking about, and suckers, crossing branches and overlapping branches. And this illustration gives you kind of an idea what they're talking about. You just want to get rid of anything that's going to be wood that's not useful or dead and cause the tree, health issues. So just those routine maintenance, and it's amazing what a difference that'll make. The next is to prune for form. You're wanting to control size, the shape, and also just simply for aesthetics. You're going to remove competing growth to maintain the tree's form. Remove weak or spindly branches because they're going to break under heavy snow or fruit load anyway. Remove downward facing branches, especially those too low to the ground, because they'll just produce poor fruit, and they're also prone to a lot of diseases. Any branch that I can't quite bring myself to take off that's low, it ends up getting scabby or whatnot, and you don't want that. Remove inward facing branches, keeping that open ventilation in the center of the tree. You really want to do that. And pinch out or prune all those water sprouts and suckers that form during the summer. So those are your basic things you're going to be looking for when you're controlling the form of the tree.
I'll mention one thing kind of, which goes back to the previous slide, that if your timing, you happen to be, it may not be the right time of year, like now, maybe it's a little too early to prune, but you're out there walking around and looking at your trees just to help remind yourself, and you see, okay, well, that branch obviously needs to go, and this one should be pruned back. You might even just tie some ribbons or colorful twine on those branches to remind you which ones need to be removed at the proper time.
Yes,
so that's just a little, sometimes we need to jog our memory, and because then you come back in the summertime and say, dang, I should have pruned that last spring,
Yes. Well, the other thing that's, in the spring, you can see the form of the tree and the shape of the tree a lot better. So, in the middle of winter, you look at that tree and you're like, oh, that limb really needs to come out. Whereas, you look at it in summer and you can't even see where the limb is. So yeah, tying something around a limb that needs to be removed just lightly can really help to remind you and to let you know which branch it was.
The other thing too is on a tree, say a tree is really severely and this applies to some of the shrubs and other stuff too, that need really major pruning, but you don't want to do it all in one year. They say don't prune more than, some rule of thumb, maybe 20% of the tree, because again, you're going to stimulate so much new growth, so that this is going to be a 3-year project to bring it back down into shape, the shape that you want it. So again, that's another place where you might be marking branches for future cutting. Again, with some with some distinctive durable twine or light
Flagging tape
wire
or
or something like that. That's colorful.
I've used flagging tape for
Yeah.
that. It's perfect.
Yeah, flagging tape lasts. Sometimes it doesn't last as long as we want it to. So,
Right. Yeah. But it stretches too with a tree's growth.
Yes.
So you don't have to worry about it strangling it. Next, we're going to prune to renew wood and promote branching. So these different illustrations will help you out. This first one over here, renewing wood, you're going to want to cut out some of those extra branches so that you have a thinner, less stuff going on there. Gives, again, that more air circulation, really important. You want to maybe you want to promote more lateral branchings. Maybe your tree doesn't look like that. Maybe it's like this over here. You do the heading cuts. You cut the lateral shoots so that they'll branch out more. It encourages further development of those branches. Here we come into the opening up the center of the tree here. Depending on the tree form you choose, cutting out a central leader encourages the formation of multiple leaders that can then be head cut themselves. Make sure to remove branches pointing into the interior of the tree when doing this. So again, opening up the tree to circulation, to light, so that the fruit can get more sunlight, so that the tree itself can just get more breathing room, so it doesn't have so much disease, places where disease can hide in your tree. This right here is a picture of that first tree you saw on the very first slide, a little bit further away. Nancy there is standing next to it. It's a 5-year-old open vase Shiro Japanese plum that's sitting in my front yard. And it does really great, lots of fruit on it. And I summer prune the heck out of that thing every year. And it responds really well to it. So just to give you a visual of what that actually looks like. I've tried to take pictures of it when it's dormant. I actually tried again, but I've got my trees pretty close together and you can't tell which tree you're looking at because the tree behind it just looks like the same picture, just flattens everything, right? So you're also going to be trying to prune to promote fruiting. So the more horizontal a branch, the more fruiting wood it produces. The above step over Espalier takes advantage of this. So this tree here is probably 2 feet, maybe 3 feet tall at most. It's probably just around the 2 foot mark, just the one branch. And you can see it's just produced all these flowers. It's awesome. I mean, I'm not sure how well that would work here, but it's really neat. So pruning cuts that encourage lateral branches and various training methods, including bending and spreading limbs, should be used to encourage the formation of spurs and fruiting wood. Additionally, fruiting spurs can be induced on a lateral shoot by a series of timed pruning cuts. So you see this illustration over here. You've got this lateral branch. If you cut that branch, it's going to form these additional branches right here. It'll also start to form little fruiting buds. If you cut that branch off then the next spring, then it'll actually start to form spurs. And these will have multiple fruiting buds on them. So that's what you're trying to do with encouraging those fruiting spurs to happen. Training fruit trees. So training fruit trees is an integral part of pruning, and it's essential when you're creating an espalier. Training just means to bend or tie a branch into a position that you desire. This combined with select pruning can manipulate a tree to grow into spectacular forms. You see this image here, it's a Belgian, what's known as a Belgian fence. Looks like it's an apple, a bunch of apples there, but they're beautiful. It is a very complicated form. You can see all the stuff behind it that's there to support it, but quite impressive and very productive. We're just going to be discussing the basics, commonly used and more practical applications of training. such as replacing a broken leader, spreading branches, and touch briefly on the formal training of Espaliers. That's my cat commenting on it. Spreading branches is one of the first things. Now, I talked about narrow crotch angles. The reason why they're bad is it traps bark between the branch right here and here, and it can create this fissure, which gives an opportunity for rot. And so what happens is when weight builds up on this branch, it just breaks away. A good angle here, this 45 to 60 degree angle, means the cells of the tree form properly and they're strong. So you can encourage the correct angle by spreading the branches, particularly when they're young. This is one method right here. This is just some sticks that they've used to spread, and these are actual ones that you can buy. Basically, it's a stick with a fork on each end, and you just press it down between the branches. Just gently spread them, and as the branch grows, you can press it a little more and spread it a little more if you want to. And it'll after a couple of years, you can remove them, and the branch will be set in at that angle. So they're really handy. Another way you can do is, especially on, again, young trees, you can take a bottle, like a soda bottle, fill it partially with water, put the cap on, and take a string and hang it from the branch and bend those branches down. Be careful. You don't want to cut off circulation in that branch. So you need to tie them so that they're not tight. But this is also a really good way to bend those branches down. Another really, really simple way is when the shoot is really young, just a clothespin. You place a clothespin next to that shoot to push it outwards instead of going up, and it'll naturally grow in that form instead. I have done this quite a bit, and it works great. So definitely encourage that. You can also use all of these methods to move a branch into a different position. Maybe you've got a branch that is too close to its neighbor, but you don't have you've got kind of an empty space next to it. You can actually use it, the same technique to push that branch where you want it to go.
One quick comment, and I saw Eric had a question about, does this encourage fruiting? Again, we're trying to stimulate the branches to grow out to that 45 degree angle or lower, and so that they do have more fruit buds forming. So that is the purpose of this shaping method. Yeah. And one more thing in the upper left, on your narrow crotch, weak crotch there, particularly if you inherit a big old tree, whether you buy a property, this is what it's got, and this is what you have. And it's there's a big one or more multiple narrow crotches on it. They can be, rather than trying to prune them off if they're too large, some folks, the tree surgeons and such, will actually drill holes through that outer branch, the smaller one, and it may drill all the way through the big main trunk, and put in either threaded rods with large washers and nuts on the outsides of those for support. And whether that may be galvanized or that may be stainless steel rods or bolts to hold that branch from being lost. Mm-hmm. Again, another method, again, on smaller trees, or particularly if you've got a fruit load, you might use, there's some really nice nylon strapping. It's a soft, about 3/4 of an inch wide, they call it tree tying tape, among other things. And you can make loops of that around the main trunk and out to a side branch to help support a fruit load. That may be more temporary than obviously putting a bolt through the tree. But again, if that's, the tree that you have has that shape, you don't want to lose half of the tree. Putting that bolt or threaded rod through there can help keep that. And the tree grows around that bolt
Yeah, there's actually a perfect example of that at the Sheldon Museum. The apple tree out in front has a bolt, just like you're saying, right in front of that, right through a limb to hold that limb on, and it works great. Yeah, and I've actually also used the tying method to hold a heavy load of fruit, you know, on a really young tree, or fairly young tree. There was a lot of fruit on one particular limb. And so I tied it up. It worked really well.
And even if you notice, if you see a branch starting to split and you want to keep that branch, or, with whether it be heavy snow, heavy fruit load, whatever the reason is that it's starting to split, even to using a large screw, again, with a large washer on the outside, so that, that eventually the tree will grow through it. But that will help, again, support, strengthen that joint until the tree itself continues to grow more, and hopefully it doesn't have too much of that trapped bark in the knot, in the crotch, where, like you say, the an opportunity for rot.
Yeah, good ideas. All right, so replacing a broken leader. So if the central leader is broken or damaged or very weak, or has a dead terminal bud, choose a vigorous lateral branch to replace it. If the best located lateral branch is growing at an oblique angle, cut back the damaged leader as close to this branch as possible. Place the stake in the ground to support the lateral branch. You'll be able to remove the stake after a couple of years. If the tree has an almost vertical lateral branch, cut back the damaged leader just above that branch, which will straighten up and eventually take over the original leader. So you can see here in this illustration, this is the damaged branch. You cut that off, put a stake in, and tie it to the stake and direct it up, and it'll take over. An alternate way of doing this is just simply say there's no branch conveniently located here. You can just cut that above some buds and do that header cut to stimulate this new growth of those buds, then pinch off any excess shoots. So you take this one off, and leave this as the leader. That's your new leader. You might have to stake it also, but it's gonna replace that old leader. Replacing a branch to generate new fruiting wood can be done by tucking it under an older branch. So right here, you've got this young shoot coming up. You take it, tuck it under this older branch, and after a few years, it'll be set, it'll be larger, and you can then just cut this off, and you have a new branch that'll produce great fruit for you. So I'm just going to touch really briefly on the Espalier. Right here, you can see there's a lot more going on into making an Espalier. You need the stakes, the wires, as we've said. You have to top it when it gets to that first wire, then it's going to stimulate those growth to come out. Then you take that, you tie those growths in, and then you eliminate some of them, leave one heading up and the others going along. You tie these into that wire that's going across. Next, this is going to take several years to do this. Finally, you'll have it so it's coming across a long ways. You keep doing it, depending if you want to have it 3 or 4 or 5 tall. You just keep on doing that. Finally, you eliminate the top, the leader, and then just continue directing that growth outwards. So it's a lot of work, a lot of time you have to spend in doing it. But it can be exceptionally rewarding. I mean, horizontal branches produce the most fruit. So you do this with an apple or a pear. You don't want to do it with a plum or a cherry. They don't like that type of treatment. But with an apple or a pear, this would be very, very effective. Just make sure you support it very well, especially if you get a lot of snow. Now, here we've got a neglected tree. This poor tree is about 100 years old. It's a crabapple. And you can see how severely congested that canopy is. The problem with this is that besides the fact that it's just hard to harvest anything from it, is the fact that snow can actually become trapped in this, and it could actually cause the whole trunk to split, which will most likely kill your tree. There's also some issues here with just the congestion of it. It's going to cause scab and disease and all sorts of stuff to happen in the center of that tree. Next up, we've got a couple other trees. This is a 40-year-old cherry and apple. They've only ever been pruned by moose and bears. They are 25 to 30 feet tall, also congested, although not as much as that other one. But the fruit is simply largely inaccessible on these trees. And the whole point of having a fruit tree is to be able to enjoy that tasty fruit. So if you can't reach it, kind of defeats the purpose, right? So as Ed said, you're going to need to spend some time. If you want to renovate a neglected tree, you're going to need to plan on taking at least 3 years to bring that tree back under control, possibly longer, but at least 3 years. And slow and steady wins this particular race. So when pruning, trees that are very large, very old, or have been feral for a long time, you really don't want to really remove more than 20% of the tree's canopy at any given time. If you prune too much, especially with an older tree, you do risk shocking and potentially killing your tree. So just be really careful when you do that, not to do too much. You want to take it in steps. Seek help and advice from a professional. And the process requires a great deal of patience, planning, and will probably take ladders and chainsaws and all those other big power tools that Ed was talking about. So you can see in this illustration, this is the tree before pruning. Here, they've really thinned out, gotten a lot of rid of the congestion. This is good. This right here is bad. You don't want to just go in there and just cut branches off. What'll happen is you get all this uncontrolled growth that, especially if it's high up, will just be a real pain and you accomplish nothing. However, topping in this fashion, it's known as pollarding. It's not normally desirable, but the resultant uncontrolled growth can actually create opportunities for pruning if it's done correctly. It must be done also at a useful height. If you do this too high, you're creating actually more death-defying ladder work for yourself. So you don't really want to do that. If you're going to do this, you want to do it right. So definitely seek help and advice for something like that.
This is something done a lot. If folks travel, to Seattle and point south, in the cities, the pollarding is really, really, really common. One of the most commonly done trees are sycamores. Mm-hmm. My son in California had 2 of these in front of his house. It had been done previous years, and you walk around his neighborhood and you can see they're, different years they do this. It needs to be done often, unfortunately. So you see it's sometimes folks may call it, looks like a lollipop to some extent too when it's pruned, because you've got these big blobs, big round growths essentially on the ends of the trees. And I've seen it done here locally, most often with the golden willows, and which actually looks pretty cool when you see it done. But still, for us, it's not a really good choice for the trees that we have. Although if we prune, the moose prune it, and then you kind of get this effect afterwards, unfortunately. But, and it would produce, if you did this, it would produce a lot of moose food also, but not great for fruit production.
No, and like I said, if done correctly, you can eliminate most of the new growth and just stick with a couple of them and make it work. But again, it's not something I would recommend for the average fruit tree. It's just not going to work very well. So this is what we do want to do. We want to take steps. So the first 1 to 2 years, you want to concentrate on neglected maintenance and the tree's form. So again, remove the dead, damaged, and diseased growth, water sprouts, suckers, crossing branches. Likely you're going to have a lot of this on a neglected tree. And you will be surprised at just what a difference this will actually make when you do that, just how much it can make a difference. Open up the framework for a good air circulation and choose the best form for your tree and prune to complement it. So step back, look at your tree. What's it trying to do already? Maybe you want to continue that and just make it shorter, or, you know, just make it so it's less crowded. Go ahead and do that. That's great. For the next 2 to 3 years, you're going to prune to renew wood and promote fruit production. So the previous year's pruning, it probably produced a flush of new growth. You want to prune and train this, applying all the same principles for regular pruning. You're just going to be doing that on a much larger scale. And then third year and beyond, you just want to keep up this good work. Keep the maintenance, maintain that structure. It's probably a lot better than it was. Keep that shape. You can concentrate on encouraging fruit production and maintaining the tree after that. So again, slow and steady, just keep going, keep doing it. A couple illustrations to remind you: thinning the branches, removing the dead, diseased, and damaged wood, those three Ds, and then how to cut that branch properly. For that heavy branch, again, cut the bark, cut the big limb off, then do your final cut at the collar. Very, very important when you're dealing with neglected trees. All right, a little hard-earned wisdom. So adjust your style. The exact mix and severity of pruning is entirely dependent upon the state of the tree and the desired results. Pruning weak growths hard will encourage them to grow into worthwhile shoots. Pruning vigorous shoots lightly, such as pinching off the terminal bud, it encourages very little growth, sometimes not any growth at all. Encourage their buds to develop. It also encourages their buds to develop into flowers instead. So that's really good to do. Fruit trees are resilient. Even if you really, really mess up, the tree is probably going to bounce back in a couple years. It'll be fine. So even when you make really big mistakes, don't fret too much about it. Remember that the more you prune, the more confident you'll become. It can be really scary at first. It was for me when I was first doing it, but after a while, you'll get a feel for it. You'll start to feel what the tree needs, how to prune it, when to prune it, and remember that just mistakes, they're just lessons. You know, you make a mistake on one tree, the next tree, you'll figure it out, or the next time you do it, you're like, okay, I won't do it that way. So don't be too hard on yourself. Just get in there, do it, learn what you need to know about it, and enjoy doing it. And then how can this be applied to other plants? The fundamentals in this presentation will serve well when pruning other plants and trees, but it's very important to know the plant you're pruning. For instance, some plants, such as walnuts and grapes, they bleed profusely if pruned when they are not fully dormant, which can stress them very badly. Others have different growth or flowering and fruiting habits that must be taken into account. Raspberry canes only live 2 years, and currants and some roses replace old wood via suckers from the ground. So if you take all those off, your plant's going to suffer. So really important to do your research, but after you do that research and with some practice, you're going to discover it's really not that hard. And it is really fun to see what you can do. So with that, thank you for attending. There's a list of recommendations, some books and websites that I would recommend. And I will go ahead and turn it over to Burl, and he can tell you about that next program, and then we will take questions.
Thank you, fellows and ladies. That was lovely. Blythe and Ed, thank you very much for a really nicely done and very comprehensive look at this interesting subject. I want to quickly pass this bowl full of names to my lovely assistant, Nancy Berlin, and she's going to pick out a name. And what the name is
Scott.
Scott. That means Stephanie Scott has won a copy of either Michael Phillips' The Holistic Orchard or Michael Reisel Planet. And I'll be getting in touch with Stephanie. She completed the survey, and the people who are Haines residents who completed the survey are part of that pool. Mandy Ramsey and Catherine Salmon won books last time. Okay, Michael Phillips is this really great author. We're going to have a super great program on March 6th. It is at 10 a.m. because he's calling in. We're Zooming him in from Groveton, New Hampshire, where he's holed up. And we're looking forward to that. Then in late March, Blythe and I will be organizing a pruning day and pruning fruit trees here in our community. And I'll be reaching out to some folks. I saw Richard Clement was on our call today, and I hope Richard will give me a call because I think getting into one of his sour cherries would be really great. And there's some other trees as well. And we'll also combine harvesting scion wood at the same time with that pruning workshop. I'm just thrilled. This has been really fun. And the Orchard Project, it has, I feel, just really helped a lot of people get serious about fruit trees. And we have people, I believe, on this call that are calling in from Oakland, California, and different places in Alaska. Who knew? So it's really been fun. Anything to add, Darren or Rob Bishop? We have some chat stuff we can get to.
I've got one briefly. We didn't talk about what do you do with all the branches that you prune off. So that's something, disposal is important, just like with pruning and weeding and other stuff. So if you got big enough chunks, certainly that makes great firewood. I know folks, I take some of my larger prunings to some folks who do some carving, make everything from bowls on down to spatulas and ladles and spoons and that sort of thing. Makes great smoking wood, at least from the apples and pears. Not so much cherries and plums is not so good for smoking salmon because they have more resins in them. So then all those branches, the smaller stuff, certainly if you can burn, I recommend burning those and then you can use the wood ashes, of course, to sweeten your soil is good, because otherwise if there's any fungus or bacterial or other problems with the on those branches, you would want to seriously get rid of them. Burl might maybe mention something about if you had a chipper that you could chip them up and compost them, perhaps, again, if they are clean, don't have an issue with disease. And then one more thing folks always ask me, and maybe you don't have as much of an issue with it, is we have lots of lichens, lots of mosses and other stuff growing on our trees. And it is beneficial to remove if you can. Gently scrape it off or use a plastic bristle scrub brush or otherwise to remove some of that, because it can hold moisture on the trunks and in the crotches of trees and result in bacterial and fungal issues in the future. So I'll quit on that one.
I'll have a question from Whitney Rapp, and I hope she's still on. When removing suckers, if you then root them, is that a viable way to get your own rootstock for future grafting, or is rootstock best purchased? It's a great question.
It is. Actually, you can use that for rootstock for yourself. If it's a rootstock that you want, if you know what the rootstock is and you know what it does and it's worked well for you on the tree that you currently have, yeah, it can be done. You do need to you have to dig down and actually remove some of the root with it, though. So depending on your tree and its health and its size, you might want to be cautious. But yes, it is a way you can do that.
And one thing on that one, removing those, and again, some kinds of rootstocks are more prone to suckering than others, unfortunately. And sometimes the people who are selling them may say that they're more or less prone to suckering, which is how they propagate them. But for those rootstocks very often, or the root sprouts, if you can get down to the base, dig away a little soil, and actually, rather than clipping them off neatly, like we talk about all the rest of this, ripping them off bodily, and then putting soil back over them, because right at the base of those roots, suckers are all sorts of hidden, dormant buds. So if you rip them off, you're getting rid of more buds, because if you clip them off where you had 3 root suckers, next year you have 12 root suckers, and you clip those off, and the next year it's exponential. So ripping them off, it is recommended to do that if you can.
Yeah, they're very much very similar to the same dominance that happens with a terminal bud. You know, you remove that and it activates the other buds. Well, the same thing happens with the roots. You just clip it off, you're activating all those other dormant ones. So yeah.
There's a good question that Alan Jones has, and it says, may I request some reflection on consistently large snow load areas? Espalier seems a reasonable and prudent option here, maybe with more prudent scaffold type framing. Now, when we're talking a snow load here, Alan Jones lives at 38 Mile. So we're talking
Lots of snow.
pretty serious snow load. And yeah.
It's possible. You'd have to have a really strong frame work for that, but totally doable if you're willing to put in the work to do that. I would be quite fascinated to see how it does work up under really heavy snow load.
Again, look at commercial orchards where they're using, sturdy, 6-inch diameter heavy duty posts, whether it be wooden posts or even steel posts. And I mean, they're using usually galvanized cable in between the posts to attach, whether that's drilled through the posts or otherwise. And then of course, just plain bracing the posts. So yeah, it's the commercial orchard folks would be the ones to look at for design for those heavy snow load conditions.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I would say about if you get your springs, if you look at like Haines's spring when it comes in town versus when it comes up the highway, kind of adjust those dates for pruning according to that too.
And then one more thing, probably just in the training of trees, we've talked in the past about different rootstocks, whether it be dwarf or semi-dwarf or full-sized. Well, those dwarf trees pretty much have to be staked, supported for their entire lives because they are dwarf. They have a smaller root system. You have to feed them more carefully too. But again, they are more easily tipped over or broken off generally. And so that support is necessary for them compared to a semi-dwarf or larger trees, which eventually don't need to be staked at some point, after 4 or 5 years, hopefully.
And also depending on the soil depth and the position of if it's a really windy location, you're probably gonna have to keep them staked forever, but yeah.
Sally Piercy is the drip line of an espalier tree a circle if on a fence or a semicircle or a wall? It's a good question.
I would imagine it kind of follows the same pattern as the fence, depending on how it's done. If you have a whole bunch of little trees espaliered together, like in cordons, then you're going to be dealing with a large thing. Otherwise, it's probably a circle, but you would have to go and do some investigating on that one. I'm not sure.
Again, depending on the rootstock is going to help tell you some of that too, to how far the roots might go. So again, with a dwarf tree that gets to be, only maybe 4 or 5 feet wide, whether that be in the espaliered, to each side, but then assuming there's good soil in front of it, it's going to grow out. Those roots are going to grow out that far also from the trunk. So maybe the roots may be less likely, they won't go out as far behind the tree on the north side of the tree, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, Patricia Phillips is asking, what do you mean by 1 year, 2 year, or 3 year wood?
Okay, I got this one. So basically 1-year-old wood is wood that is literally 1 year old. It grew last year. 2-year-old wood is wood that grew 2 years ago or started as a shoot 2 years ago, and so on and so forth. So apples, they only fruit on 3-year-old wood. That means when you first have a shoot come out, that year you're not going to get any buds or fruit on that shoot. The next year you're not going to get any buds and fruit on that shoot, although they will form that year. The year after that is when they will finally produce a flower and potentially produce fruit if you've got a pollinator. So that's what we mean by the 1 year, 2 year, or 3-year-old wood.
And then, of course, if we're selecting for cyanwood, which you'll be talking about later, that 1 year old wood, the newest growth, is what we want to take for cyanwood to be used for grafting. We cut it in March or early April while it's dormant, and then it'll be used for cyanwood a little later this spring.
Yep. I saw a question that got skipped. Do Sitka roses grow from suckers or old wood? They grow from everything.
Yes.
The more you prune them, the more they'll pop up more stuff. So yeah, they can be a real pain in the butt if they're a place where you don't want them.
Or not to mention seeds too.
Yes, this too. Yes, very much so.
From Kimberly Owens, and a question for Rob Bishop. When do you prune in a hoop house or a greenhouse?
Yeah, Burl, you're just not as limited to when you need to prune in a hoop house. Generally speaking, you just don't have the rain all the time. The humidity often brings the diseases and stuff, which, some greenhouses are full of humidity, but we open them up and, but they are allowed to, they're able to dry out, unlike things outside all year long, which is why Blythe was talking about earlier, trying to pick nice days to prune your trees. So realistically, I'll just say after New Year's and on, you could pretty much do hoop house pruning most of the dormant season, but for the most part, just after New Year's all the way through the spring.
And then a question from Jameson and Terry. Who do you recommend buying trees from?
Yeah, we had this in the beginning, one of the first presentations that were done. So you can look at that, but basically the ones that we recommend are, Ed, I believe you sell trees.
I do. I bring in trees from down south, but again, I've learned what,
where to get them, who has the good stuff.
Right.
I believe Rob Bishop also sells locally. Gami's Garden sells locally. I'm not sure of the Glacier. There's a Glacier place in Juneau that sells.
Glacier Gardens and Landscape Alaska sell fruit trees, and some of us work together on advice to choose the right varieties for Alaska.
I would definitely check out that presentation from the first presentation, because that discussed the types of trees and also the places to buy from. If you're going to go out of state, nursery online, look for a Rain Tree Nursery is really good. One Green World, Burnt Ridge Nursery, Fedco Trees. I think I got most of them there.
Behringer is a favorite of mine, north of Seattle in Mount Vernon. That's where a lot of them come from. Good.
Yeah. So there's a lot of options, but when you're looking for trees that you want to buy, if you find a nursery, check it out. Look for the reviews. Make sure they have good reviews. You're not going to get all good reviews on anything, but make sure they've got primarily good reviews, because there are a lot of scams, unfortunately, out there. Something looks too good to be true, it probably is. So look out for, cut prices and stuff like that.
I'll mention one more where Southeast Alaska Master Gardeners are putting on a mini garden conference the 19th and 20th of March. And two of the speakers are from Northwoods Nursery. That's down south near Molalla, Oregon. I get a lot of trees from them also. They are a wholesale nursery only, but they're going to be talking about not so much, not the common apple and cherry trees, but more uncommon fruits that Jim has brought back from Russia and China and other interesting places. So that you can sign up more Zoom programming through the Southeast Alaska Master Gardeners. And that registration is online now.
That's great. Okay.
A question from Pauline Strong. Is it possible to identify the variety of unknown fruit trees, such as a sweet cherry?
That's really hard. There are so many that look so much alike. Sometimes you can partially at least identify them by when they bloom in relation to others. If they're early, if they're sort of mid-season, or if they're late, you can kind of get an idea maybe what they might be, whether or not they crack easily in the rain, whether or not, or if they do, their color, things like that. So you can kind of identify them maybe, but it can be very difficult.
Yes, and there is genetic testing available, but it costs way more money than you probably want to pay for apples and cherries and other fruits too. And the problem is, and then if there were a commercial tree to start with, and then if there are volunteer trees, then the hybridization, Mother Nature's hybridization happens, and then it gets even
what it is. You're right. Yeah.
I would say enjoy the trees, enjoy the fruit they make. And if you want to make more of them, then you have to graft.
Something that is related to that is the importance of identifying both the rootstock and the variety of the tree, so that when you get a tree from a nursery, you know both what its rootstock is and the variety of the plant, of the cultivar, and you've got a tag that is a permanent record that is attached to the tree, and maybe you keep some notes in your little orchard plan book, so that you have that permanently recorded and filed away somewhere in case it got lost.
And then you pass it on, and then you pass that on to the new owners at some point if you decide to sell your place.
Rob Bishop has a question for Ed and Blythe. Have you ever encountered fire blight?
I have not. You, Ed?
I have seen fire blight come up on Saskatoons, Amelanchier. I have not seen it. I've seen it down south, but not up here. We don't have, I had a few pairs and I got rid of them. I didn't have a problem with it on those. And on those Saskatoons, actually watched them. I cut the branches off that I saw were infested. And the next year there was not fire blight again. So I believe, I won't swear to this, that we are not in a favorable climate for fire blight growth, because I know it tends to be warm and moist conditions, but again, having it there too. Where I did see it we planted a pear tree down at my son's place in Napa, California. It had fire blight. We cut it off.
Yeah, as far as I know, I did some research on fire blight, and I don't think that it's here, like you were saying, that the conditions here aren't really favorable for it. So I don't think it's here in Alaska. But having said that, since we import so many trees, fruit trees, it's easy to bring it in. So do be aware of it and pay attention. And fire blight, for those who are wondering what it is, basically it's I think it's some sort of pathogen that gets in the tree, virus or something like that, that causes a limb to completely die back, and the limb will look actually as if the leaves will all shrivel up and look like they've been burned. And that's why it's called fire blight. And usually
you'll see it's distinctive. It'll kind of make somewhat of a shepherd's crook, like an upside, as that part dies back, the leaves shrivel. And there'll usually be some other sort of cankerous growths in the lower part of that dying part. So again, you know, if you see that, if you don't want to get rid of the tree altogether, cut down way down below that into good clean live wood and really, you know, get rid of it into the garbage, into a plastic bag, into the garbage, and
Burn it.
sterilize,
Yeah.
sterilize your tools.
Yeah. Yeah. Burn
Yeah.
it if you can. And when in doubt and you're not sure, burn that and just like burn it real good.
Well, any additional questions? And if we have them now, speak your mind, or I will be bidding you all farewell.
I see a little comment here, and then your chickens remove all your plant tags. Oh, absolutely. They love doing that. So make sure you, like what I do with mine is I actually have a diagram since I have so many fruit trees. And all mine are labeled, the diagram is labeled with the variety, the rootstock, and the year I planted it. So keep that, and even if the chickens do play havoc with your tags, you will still have a reference so that you can fix it.
Anything else for the good of the order?
I just saw a comment from Michelle Zeiger about the sour cherry with suckers. The nice thing about that in Haines, in Juneau, is that as you say, it's not on a rootstock. So, I mean, there are suckers and suckers and suckers that have been propagated all over, I would say, northern southeast Alaska, and they come true. So take those suckers, move them, plant them. I'm going to be digging some up this year, and I'm going to plant them in pots, and they're going to be, I mean, around here we call them telephone hill cherries. In Haines, they're called Haines pie cherries. And yeah, dig them up, use them, propagate them, share them.
They're
and
great.
More cherries.
They're really great.
Yep.
It says here this tree isn't on. Okay, can I use the suckers to graft? I assume you're wanting to graft another variety onto the sucker. Yes, you could. I'm not sure that you could put a sweet cherry onto a sour cherry sucker. I don't know if that's compatible or not, but you could put a different kind of sour cherry on it for sure.
Yes.
Are they?
Darren,
they're compatible?
Yes. Yeah. For sweet cherries on sour cherries, yes.
Okay, cool.
And the sour cherries are somewhat dwarfing. I'm not sure to what extent, where a sweet cherry has a potential to get much larger. I have a seedling out here that's huge. You know, in 20 years, it has grown to be 30 feet tall and is 12 inches in diameter. Yeah. So it's
sweet like cherries. That. They are natural.
So that can help dwarf a sweet cherry somewhat.
One thing to remember: using a rootstock that's suckered a whole bunch to graft another variety onto it, you're always going to be dealing with suckers from that graft. Then, so you know, just keep that in mind. Whatever graft rootstock that you use, if it suckers a lot, you might have your whole yard taken over by the wrong thing if you don't keep up maintenance.
And that's exactly what happens in Juneau in people's yards, where because the roots are so shallow, if in a yard where they're mowing, sometimes the roots are at the surface and lawnmower goes across, scalps the root off, and up pops 3 suckers. So yeah, there's thickets of cherry trees downtown around the federal building that happen that way.
Darren has a comment about fire blight. Fortunately, we are slightly cooler than what the fire blight bacteria prefer, except in greenhouses and high tunnels. From the University of California Extension, the ideal conditions for the infection, disease development, and spread of the pathogen are rain and humidity, weather with a daytime temperature of 75 to 85, especially when the night temperatures stay above 55. So we're not quite in that zone.
Yeah, a little out of it. So yeah, that's good.
Well, boys and girls, thank you so much. And I want to also particularly say, Blythe, you did a wonderful job putting that together. Blythe really organized the slideshow, and thanks so much.
Thank you.